The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of tension, the rustle of papers, hushed murmurs of spectators, and the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering and professional. It was just another day, another case. Or at least, that's what she thought. State of Louisiana versus James Anderson, the bailiff called out. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers brushing the smooth, polished oak of the bench. She glanced at the case file in front of her. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. Another day, another lost soul tangled in the web of the system. A familiar ache settled deep within her chest. How many more stories like this had she heard? How many more would she hear before it all just became noise? But then the defendant was brought in, and everything stopped. There, standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, was not just any man. It was James Anderson. Her James. Her breath caught in her throat, a flood of memories crashing over her all at once. The summer afternoons they'd spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The late-night talks under the old magnolia tree in her backyard. The promises they'd made as children. Always have each other's backs no matter what. But this man, this was not the boy she remembered. The boy who used to laugh freely and dream of a future, without the weight of the world bearing down on him. The man before her now was hunched, worn and weathered. His face lined with hardship. And yet his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, unmistakable. Eleanor's hand trembled as it hovered over the gavel, her pulse quickening. This was impossible. How? How had this happened? James lifted his gaze to meet hers, shock and resignation flickering across his face. Recognition passed between them like a silent thunderclap. But then, just as quickly, he looked away, his head bowing slightly. The room held its breath. Eleanor struggled to speak. Her voice cracked, but she pushed through, forcing herself to do her job. Mr. Anderson, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead? James's voice, when it came, was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. Not guilty, Your Honor. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to stop everything, to demand answers. What had happened to him? How had their paths diverged so drastically? But she couldn't. Her role as judge demanded composure, impartiality. She had to be steady. She had to remain in control. Proceed, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, even as the prosecutor began his opening statements. But in her mind chaos reigned. This wasn't just another case. This was James. And somehow, she had to figure out how to separate the girl she once was from the woman she had become, before it was too late. As the prosecutor's words blurred in the background, Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to a time long before black robes and gavels. Back to the dusty streets of Hammond. She and James had grown up on opposite sides of the town, not divided by distance, but by the invisible, suffocating lines of segregation that defined their world. Her family's house, neat and white with a picket fence. James's home, weathered and worn, sitting at the end of a dirt road surrounded by fields. And yet they had found each other. Their friendship had been an anomaly, an act of defiance against a world that wasn't ready for it. She remembered the day they met, how it all started with a simple gesture. She had wandered too far from her own backyard, and ended up at the edge of a creek where James was fishing, his line tangled in the reeds. She had offered to help. And just like that, an unlikely bond was formed. A bond that would defy the whispers, the sideways glances, and the disapproving glares. She could still hear his voice in her mind. You ever think about leaving this place? Really getting out? Going somewhere people don't look at us funny, just for sitting together? She had laughed it off then, brushing the idea aside. But James, he wasn't joking. Even as a child, he saw the world for what it was, a place that didn't always have room for someone like him. Despite everything, their bond had deepened. But it was always there, that pressure, the weight of the world bearing down on them. And then one day it ended. It was the summer before high school when Eleanor's father caught them sitting together on the porch. His voice had been cold, sharp with authority. Eleanor, get inside. Now. She had hesitated, glancing at James, who stood frozen in place. Go on, he had said quietly. I'll see you around. But they hadn't seen each other again, not really. Her father forbade her from going near him. Soon after, James's family moved away. Eleanor threw herself into her studies, her ambitions carrying her far from Hammond, far beyond the town that had once been her world. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But despite everything, despite the years, she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. Now, sitting on the bench, Eleanor wondered what had become of James after she had walked into that house, closed the door on their friendship. His record, when she checked, showed a series of minor offenses: petty theft, loitering. Nothing that screamed violence. But then again, how much could you really see from just a few lines on a rap sheet? The prosecutor's voice cut through her thoughts, snapping her back to the present. He was detailing the alleged crime. James had supposedly assaulted a store clerk during a robbery in Baton Rouge. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. James had been picked up just a few blocks away, the cash still in his possession. Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him. But his expression? It was unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to this story than the prosecution was letting on? The courtroom recessed for lunch, giving Eleanor a brief moment to gather her thoughts. As she returned to her chambers, her assistant, Margaret, approached, her face full of concern. "Judge Hayes, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted," Margaret asked, her voice hesitant. Eleanor hesitated. Should she tell Margaret? Would it be unprofessional to admit she knew the defendant? In the end, she just shook her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be, when the past she had buried so deeply was now sitting in front of her, waiting for her judgment? The courtroom was packed when the trial resumed. Reporters scribbling notes, the clerk shuffling papers, and the prosecutor, Richard Powell, a sharp-faced man with a commanding presence, ready to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm, "this case is about violence." The courtroom was thick with tension, the air charged with anticipation. The quiet buzz of whispered conversations, the faint shuffle of papers, the occasional thud of a gavel striking in the distant chambers. It all blended into a hum that seemed to vibrate through Eleanor's very bones. But none of it could drown out the words of the prosecutor. "This case," Richard Powell began, his voice cold and firm, "is about violence. It's about a man who walked into a convenience store, and without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of this crime." Eleanor's stomach tightened, the knot in her gut pulling tighter with every word. Powell's tone was detached, clinical. No hint of empathy, no room for doubt. James Anderson, reduced to just a name on a docket. But was that all he was? Eleanor glanced at the defendant, James, sitting motionless, his gaze fixed on the table before him, his posture betraying nothing. The defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to make her opening statement. She was young, but there was no mistaking the confidence that radiated from her. Her voice rang clear across the room as she challenged the prosecution's narrative. "The prosecution would have you believe this case is straightforward. But it's not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the very start. We will show you that there is more to this story. We will show you that the assumptions made on the night of the arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." Eleanor's attention snapped back to the courtroom as the first witness was called, the store clerk. He described seeing a man fitting James's description enter the store, argue with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. His testimony was detailed, yet there was something off about it. Something rehearsed. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as Lisa began her cross-examination, each question surgical in its precision. "Mr. Chambers," Lisa's voice cut through the tension, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" The witness nodded, his voice shaking slightly. "Yes. And did you see his face clearly?" Lisa pressed. The witness hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. "Not really. It was dark, and he had the hood up." Lisa's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "So, you couldn't definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" The witness faltered, his confidence slipping. "Well, no. No further questions," Lisa said, cutting him off before he could say more. Eleanor watched James shift slightly in his seat. His shoulders squared as though the cross-examination had given him a small flicker of hope. She felt her pulse quicken, but she couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. Next came the surveillance footage. The grainy, poorly lit video showed a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The prosecution claimed it was James, but the video was so unclear, so grainy, that it was impossible to make out any identifying features. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes trained on the screen. Could that figure really be James? The footage was brief, far too brief. The figure moved quickly, snatching something from the counter before disappearing off-screen. The video cut out, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. James's defense hinged on an alibi. He claimed he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery, but the friend refused to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa argued that the lack of a willing witness didn't negate James's innocence. But the jury's expression spoke volumes. They weren't convinced. And neither was Eleanor. Not entirely. As the trial wore on, the weight of her position pressed down on her. She was supposed to be impartial, a figure of fairness in the midst of this turmoil. But how could she remain impartial when every moment brought her back to the past? When the boy she once knew so well, her closest friend, was now a man standing before her, fighting for his freedom, and she was the one tasked with determining his fate. When the court adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of the gavel. She wanted to reach out to James, to ask him, to demand the truth. But she couldn't. Not without jeopardizing everything, the case, her career. The unspoken rules of the courtroom demanded distance. As she watched James being escorted out of the room in shackles, Eleanor's resolve wavered. She had always believed in the justice system. Believed it would reveal the truth, no matter how hidden. But now, for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something the system could ever truly grasp. The next day, the courtroom was even more charged. It was the defense's turn, and Lisa Porter called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her mind sharpening. This was it. This was where the cracks, if any, might begin to show. Officer Harris took the stand, a burly man with a gruff demeanor. Lisa approached him, her pace deliberate, her voice calm but laced with authority. Officer Harris, she began, you were the one who apprehended my client, correct? That's right, Harris replied, his tone clipped, unyielding. You stated in your report that Mr. Anderson was walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct? Yes, Harris answered. Lisa paused, then pressed on. And what led you to believe he was the suspect? Harris shifted in his seat. He matched the description. A black male mid-40s, wearing dark clothing. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Dark clothing? But the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie on Mr. Anderson when you searched him? Harris hesitated, his gaze faltering. No, but he could have discarded it. Lisa took a step closer, her voice edged with disbelief. Could have? Did you or any other officer search the surrounding area to find this supposed hoodie? Harris's jaw tightened. No, we didn't have time. He was apprehended quickly. Lisa didn't let up. So to clarify, you arrested my client based on a vague description, without any physical evidence linking him to the scene? The silence that followed spoke volumes. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the jury. A few members exchanged uncertain glances, their skepticism now palpable. Lisa wasn't done yet. Officer Harris, she pressed. Do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest? He protested, Harris replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he was innocent. Did you consider investigating his claim? Lisa asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Or did you simply assume his guilt based on his appearance? Harris's face reddened. I followed protocol, he muttered, clearly rattled. Protocol, Lisa repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. No further questions, Your Honor. As Harris stepped down from the witness stand, his credibility in tatters, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment. This trial was no longer just about James. It was about a system too quick to judge, too quick to condemn. And the battle for truth had only just begun. There was no definitive way to confirm that the figure in the video was James. No clear evidence to tie him to the crime. And then, to make matters worse, the timestamp on the footage had been altered, an alarming detail that cast doubt on its credibility. The prosecutor, unfazed, tried to dismiss the expert testimony as mere conjecture. But the jury? They weren't so easily swayed. A shadow of doubt lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. Eleanor could feel it, like a weight pressing down on her chest, growing heavier with every passing moment. As the day drew to a close, the moment arrived. James was given the chance to testify on his own behalf. Lisa had warned him of the risks. It could make or break everything. But James insisted. He needed to speak for himself. His chains clinked softly as he approached the stand, each sound echoing through the courtroom, amplifying the tension. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost trembling, but it carried a raw sincerity that cut through the room. "I've made mistakes in my life," James began, his words like a quiet confession. He locked eyes with the jury. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this." His voice faltered, but he didn't back down. "That night, I was just walking home, minding my own business when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask any questions. They just decided I fit the bill." His words caught in his throat. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than what people assume about me. But this is different. I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's heart twisted. His words hung in the air like a plea, not just for justice, but for humanity. She couldn't look away. The jury's faces? A blend of doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This wasn't just about facts anymore. It was about the weight of prejudice, about assumptions that could alter the course of a life. The truth, Eleanor realized, wasn't just hidden in the evidence. It was buried beneath years of misunderstanding, of overlooked humanity. She had to be impartial. She had to ensure fairness. But how could she, when every moment in this courtroom was a constant reminder of the boy she had once known? The boy who had become a man, now fighting for his freedom. And she was the one tasked with deciding his fate. The final day of the trial arrived, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The closing arguments were delivered with precision, each side cementing their case. The prosecutor leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the process. Lisa, however, urged the jury to look deeper, to see the flaws, the gaps in the case. To see the man behind the charges, not just the defendant. Eleanor's mind raced. She had a duty. She couldn't influence the jury. But she knew deep down, if the verdict left room for interpretation, she would have the final word. The weight of that responsibility was suffocating. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom was emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs, whispered among themselves. James sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, not once looking her way. How could he? What could she say? The finality of it all hung in the balance. Then the moment arrived. The jury had reached a verdict. The room fell silent as the foreperson stood, the paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant. The pause. The silence. It stretched on unbearable. And then the words, "not guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps, murmurs, even a few cheers. Eleanor's gavel came down with sharp precision, restoring order. James's shoulders slumped, as if a weight had been lifted. But his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, yes. But it was clear, this victory had come at a cost. Eleanor addressed the court, her voice steady. "The jury has spoken. Mr. Anderson, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." The words seemed so final, but they didn't feel final at all. Not to her. As the courtroom emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, her eyes fixed on James as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word. But then he turned and approached her, his expression guarded, his steps measured. "You don't owe me anything," James said quietly, standing a few feet from her bench. "But I'd like to know. Why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor's throat tightened. The words wouldn't come at first. "Because I couldn't," she whispered, the weight of her answer sinking in. "I had to be fair. If I had said anything, it might have jeopardized the case." James studied her for a long moment, his face a blend of hurt and understanding. Fair, he repeated softly, a bitter edge to the word. That's the thing, Eleanor. The world's never been fair. Not for people like me. Her gaze dropped to the polished wood of the bench. She had no words to fix the brokenness between them. But she did have this, you're right. I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now. James sighed, the tension easing slightly in his posture. We were kids. We didn't know any better. He paused. But you know now, don't you? Eleanor met his eyes, her voice firm. I do. And I'm sorry. James gave a faint nod, then turned and walked away, his back straight as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Eleanor sat alone in the empty courtroom, the silence deafening. The weight of his words pressed down on her. She had upheld the law, but in doing so, she had glimpsed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any one person. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that her position wasn't just a seat of power. It was a platform for change. As she stepped out of the courtroom, the fading sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps. Eleanor made a silent vow to herself. She couldn't change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure the future held more than just hollow promises of fairness. It would be hard. It might even be impossible, but she owed it to James and to herself to try. Eleanor stood still for a moment, watching as the last of the courthouse staff filed out. The air was cool against her skin, the evening sky painted with hues of orange and purple. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind her, the distant murmur of the city as it carried on, oblivious to the battle that had just unfolded in that courtroom. She had done her duty, but the weight of the day, of the trial, of James's words, lingered pressing against her chest. As she made her way down the courthouse steps, the last remnants of daylight began to fade. It was a new beginning for James, a second chance. But for Eleanor, it was a stark reminder that justice was never as simple as right and wrong. It was about the gray areas in between, the moments when the truth was harder to see, and even harder to act upon. She paused for a second, breathing in the cool evening air. It wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward something more, something better. It wasn't about fixing everything, about erasing the past. No, that was impossible. But what she could do, what she would do, was make sure that going forward, she would never stop questioning, never stop seeking a better way. The courthouse doors closed behind her with a soft thud, and as she walked away, the last of the sun dipped below the horizon. The future was uncertain, but Eleanor knew this much. It would be hers to shape, one choice at a time.